The cowardice for me, the central cowardice, is the people who just don't speak out. There's so many Western journalists who know a terrible evil has been committed, but they haven't said anything because they fear the consequences for their careers. They fear they'll get piled on and smeared, and guess what? That's true, by the way. That's rational. It's rational to think your career will be threatened if you speak out about the truth about Palestine. It's rational to think you'll be smeared, but you know what? You're not a Palestinian journalist getting blown up alongside your entire family. You're not a Palestinian journalist thinking every day, every last moment, every moment could be your last, and often it being your last. Journalists are keeping receipts about who did what and who didn't do what, who didn't speak out when they could have done. And those people are going to get exposed. And absolutely no question about that. Everyone needs to know that now. You're going to get exposed if you didn't speak out, or you just used empty platitudes when you could have used your platform to call out one of the worst crimes of our age. In Rwanda, after that genocide, journalists went to prison. Their defence that they weren't using machetes didn't stop them from being sent to prison. Just because people aren't dropping bombs doesn't mean they're not facilitating genocide. The Genocide Convention 1948 has 5 crimes. One of them is genocide, but the other one is complicity in genocide, and the other is public incitement of genocide. Yeah. But in any case, careers need to be ruined.
The media has been central to Israel's ability to get their genocide done in Gaza. From omitting incriminating facts about the crimes in Gaza to uncritically repeating Israel's propaganda, they have created the moody music that has allowed nearly 2 years of this horrific assault. With me today is one of the only voices within the British mainstream media who has consistently opposed the genocide and exposed the role of his media colleagues. Owen Jones, thank you very much for joining me today.
What an honour, honestly. Honestly, could not be more thrilled.
Yeah, you interviewed me many times before.
I have. The tables have been turned. But seriously, it's such an honour because, you know, you're one of the most important voices we have. So it's an honour to be on the receiving end of this really plush. Look at this. It's so high tech. Nice. The future has arrived.
You know, what can I say? I don't want to say thanks to the genocide we have this, but we as journalists, as media personnel, we have to do something about this genocide. And one of the fruits, maybe I shouldn't say fruits, but a new media is emerging right now due to the genocide. And that's because everyone realized how bad the mainstream media was on the genocide. But Owen, I want to start by actually congratulating you for this wonderful speech you gave at the Amnesty International Media Awards. I was there, and when you spoke, that gave me goosebumps. I was really amazed with how powerful this speech was. It spoke for all of us, for all of the journalists who were disappointed by the mainstream media. So thank you for giving that speech. And congratulations for receiving this award. Well deserved, Owen. So many times when I attend these festivals, when I meet with many journalists, whether it was at the Amnesty International or recently at the Parliament when that report went out against the BBC coverage, I always meet with so many journalists who work within the BBC or Sky News or some of the mainstream media outlets. And these journalists are good people. Some of them are amazing people, amazing journalists. And I always ask them this question. If you know that the outlet that you work for is extremely biased to Israel, and that is complicit in the war crimes in Gaza and the genocide in Gaza, I would ask them, why do they continue to work there? And they would always respond that they want to fix these outlets from inside. My question to you, Owen, and I know that you have experience in that, you work for The Guardian. Can these media outlets be fixed or not?
It's really interesting because I did this report for Dropsite News it was, you know, a lengthy piece kind of exploring the BBC's dire, catastrophic reporting on Israel's Western facilitated genocide in Gaza, and the point I would make, you know, my view, which I expressed in that piece, was that the Western media has played a pivotal role in facilitating the genocide. It wouldn't have been possible without the Western media, because public opinion in Britain from the beginning was, you know, against Israel's onslaught. Within 2 weeks, the YouGov poll showed over half said they definitely supported a genocide. Another 30% said probably, and only 3% said definitely not, which is the same number who think the earth is flat. You know, most support an arms embargo by a large majority. 70% think Israel's committed war crimes. Most think Benjamin Netanyahu should be arrested for war crimes and crimes against humanity as per his arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. And that pressure from the public, the one thing that has, or one of the key things that stopped it. And by the way, it's incredible public opinion is where we're at, given the coverage of the Western media.
Yeah.
So people just, you know, there's only so much you can turn the world upside down.
Well, thanks to social media.
Exactly.
Thanks to the Palestinian journalists who are risking their lives in Gaza.
Exactly. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, it's Palestinian journalists who suffered the biggest massacre of journalists in human history. And using social media, and people can see the reality versus what mainstream media is serving up for them. And I think that has, we'll talk about it, created a crisis of confidence, which is partly why these sorts of outlets are so important. And when I did that report, I mean, the BBC journalists I spoke to had exactly that, expressed that dilemma, which was, do we work here and try and get the reports out, which, you know, as best we can, or is this irretrievable and are we just, in the end, part of a machine which is facilitating a genocide? I mean, I guess, you know, partly, I think, to be honest, what's important for those people who are within those media outlets is to bear witness, by the way. Because, I mean, for example, that report I did in the BBC was only, I interviewed 13 BBC journalists.
13?
Yeah. And they were able to, explain to me what was going on with the systemic bias, which is what we're talking about, because the problem is systemic. It's not about bad people here and there, and if you get rid of these few bad people and put some good people in, it'll be fixed. It's a systemic problem, which is the problems that those individuals are facing. And I think it is important they bear witness, because we actually need to know what is actually happening behind the scenes as best we can. I think that's crucial for the reckoning to come, because there has to be a reckoning about what the Western media did to the people of Palestine, because they helped facilitate genocide. In Rwanda, after that genocide, journalists went to prison. Their defence that they weren't using machetes didn't stop them from being sent to prison. Just because people aren't dropping bombs doesn't mean they're not facilitating genocide. The Genocide Convention of 1948 has 5 crimes. One of them is genocide, but the other one is complicity in genocide, and the other is public incitement of genocide. Yeah. But in any case, careers need to be ruined over this. The careers weren't ruined over the Iraq War. The only people who suffered consequences are the people who opposed the Iraq War seem to be too critical, and that helped pave the way for the catastrophe we're currently in. So I do think it's important for people to bear witness and to be able to explain what actually happened. And, you know, it's true, you know, what also happens is, because you do get examples of good coverage, and what's striking about those examples. So, for example, the CNN did this piece recently, basically exposing Israeli guilt for the aid massacres. And there was, you know, they did one about the flower massacre last year. The fact I'm talking about aid massacres and flower massacres just shows the dystopia that obviously we're living in, or the people of Palestine, have been subjected to. And, you know, the problem is those pieces is they're too little, too late, lack prominence, and they're siloed. They're detached from the wider reporting. So you'll get Israeli lies sometimes critiqued and torn apart by this or that piece of mainstream media coverage. But then it's like Groundhog Day. It's like the rest of the coverage doesn't shift to take into account that objectively Israel lies to its teeth over and over again about the atrocities that it's perpetrating. So, I mean, you know, there have been those good examples of problem they're siloed. I think my own view, and this is obviously a view people will take, is I do think when it comes to the BBC and Sky News, we need to know who did what. And we only know that because there are people willing to share their testimonies. But that's my view, I don't know.
So other than sharing testimonies, do you think that these journalists, when they work there, they can fix the BBC and the coverage of the BBC? Because, listen, at the end of the day, there is a genocide that's happening in Palestine, and every day more and more Palestinians are dying because of the Israeli genocide, and also because of the complicity, or maybe the complicity of the mainstream media and the misinformation and the disinformation. So for me as a Palestinian, we don't have time to wait we need an immediate fix right now, and we can't wait longer. So what is your advice to these journalists who are good people, who are good journalists, who want to help, who are disgusted with the genocide, who are disgusted with the narrative of their own outlets? Should they stay or should they leave?
I think we need to build an infrastructure outside which would allow them to take their expertise and allow it to flourish. That's why we've got responsibility to build those media infrastructures. Because actually it's interesting in the US at the moment. I mean, you know, I mentioned Dropsite News, which I did work for, and they do investigative journalism.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're lacking at the moment. We don't have media outlets because investigative journalism takes so much time. It's so much time and resources and effort.
Yeah.
And I think what's useful at the moment is we're building a kind of, I don't know, like a universe of different like this, for example, and obviously others that are springing up. But it would be really useful and quite something if we were able to take some of those journalists into those media outlets and help them build and create something which is new and an alternative. I think the problem at the moment we have is if we ask people to leave, it's that then do what? You know, what's the shift? What's the change? What's the material difference? Because you know, we lack. I mean, the problem that we have at the moment in the mainstream media is the press is largely owned by right-wing moguls who are entirely supportive of Israel's genocide, and the BBC is an establishment stitch-up. It's supposed to be an independent public service broadcaster, but in practice, it's got the imprint of the state all over it. I mean, they, you know, in terms of the levers they've got over the BBC board, the license fee payers. I mean, there are those. For example, the media reform campaigner Tom Mills, Tom Miller, sorry, wrong Tom, who's written about could the BBC be transformed and democratised and you know, to do what it's supposed to do. The only way it can do that, I feel, is to build alternative media organisations which put pressure on them. Because what is happening at the moment, as you noted, the work of Palestinian journalists, in particular, and social media, has exposed the truth, which people wouldn't have seen. Can you imagine this was happening in 1992? Like, most people just have 4 TV channels. No internet. Yeah. You have 4 TV channels, and you have the radio.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't be hearing anything from Gaza. We'd literally be hearing nothing or seeing nothing. They would have banned foreign journalists from entering. The Palestinian journalists there, how on earth would they get anything out? It'd be literally impossible.
No, it happened before, Owen.
Of course.
The Nakba and the Naksa.
Exactly.
And the many, many wars that happened before. It's happening all over again now. But the only difference is that there are smartphones, that there are journalists in Palestine.
Exactly. And this time, exactly. And that is causing a crisis of confidence in mainstream media outlets, because it's showing the gap that exists between the reality and, you know, people can see, well, this atrocity hasn't been covered, or this atrocity has been whitewashed, or this is clearly Israel that's done it and they won't attach culpability, or, you know, I mean, it's just people can see the lies by omission, and lies by omission are still lies when you're deceiving your audience. I mean, examples, you know, which I always come back to, the examples of genocidal and criminal intent issued by Israeli leaders and officials all the way from the beginning of the genocide, the start of the genocide, which were either buried by Western media outlets with no context about what they represented, but they were like at the end of like 20 paragraphs, or they just were not covered at all. And obviously, the media coverage should be framed around those statements of intent, which were the most accurate roadmap about what Israel actually has done to the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine and elsewhere. And instead, what these media outlets have done is treat those statements as though they're happening in a parallel universe, which isn't real, even though they're confessions of intent. And then instead, the Israeli right reply is just some English language press statement issued by an IDF press officer, written for Western audiences, which is completely different from what Israeli leaders and officials are saying in Hebrew to the Israeli people and Israeli soldiers. But that, again, without, social media and has allowed people to see that in a way they wouldn't have done before. You can see all these blood-curdling threats and intent. I just think that is causing a crisis because there was already a crisis going on. I think people under Tory rule saw the role of the BBC, and the BBC, has operated generally. It shifts towards whoever's in power, and there's this infamous example of Andrew Marr, the political editor of the BBC, back in 2003 after the fall of Baghdad in the Iraq War, and it is unbelievable. Well, maybe it isn't unbelievable, and he just, he's there saying, "This is a massive, total success for Tony Blair." His critics have been humiliated. Wow. They will have too much pride to admit they were completely wrong in every single way. I'm not joking. I'm not even doing an exaggeration. So the BBC's always had that role, particularly on foreign policy, where it will defer to the priorities of the British establishment. So if the British establishment wants to go to war, then the BBC will start laying the foundations that something has to be done, And, they won't show the crimes being committed by allies of the West. And they will build, and they did that in the run-up to the of the Iraq War, and suddenly something has to be done. So I just think that's always been their role, but this time the scale of the crime is so extreme and so confessed to and so documented. No crime's been so documented as it happened, both by its victims and its perpetrators, because obviously IDF soldiers are just boasting on social media about what they're doing. So that is creating a crisis, and I think that is meaning that people are shifting to other sources of information, because there was all this hysteria for a while about online disinformation. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but it's like when people can see the disinformation and misinformation by a public broadcaster, they don't have any authority to speak about that. And it's going to cause, and I don't think they'll recover. The BBC will never recover from this, and nor should it recover from this, because they've helped facilitate a genocide. I mean, that's a Rubicon you cross if you help facilitate a genocide, because if the BBC had done its job, made clear what Israel's intent was from the start, actually presented the crimes being committed accurately, stopped deferring to self-evident lies from the Israeli state, treated Palestinian life as having equal worth to any other life, then the pressure on the government to stop facilitating genocide would have been insurmountable. So, they can't recover from this, and I think that's why we have to build something new. Could that pressure then, in a future, government, because you could have a government that does media reform, based on the work done by the media outlets, and then change the BBC. Maybe that could happen, but we'd have to have a completely different government, wouldn't we? Yeah.
Okay, we talked a lot in the past 2 years about the BBC, the Sky News, the right-wing media in this country. But we have not talked about The Guardian. And you write a column for The Guardian. How do you evaluate The Guardian's reporting on Palestine during this genocide?
It's a very good question, which I have to be careful how I answer, but it's a very fair question. You should ask me this. You should scrutinise this. I mean, obviously, I write my column for The Guardian, and I've used that position as best I can to, my latest column is about the BBC and the BBC's outrageous role in this genocide. Last week, I wrote about Palestine Action and its prescription by the state, and obviously, I do that to try and reach audiences that I'm not reaching with my videos and social media and so on. I suppose I'd ask, firstly, all my colleagues, how every media outlet will face a reckoning in the years to come about their coverage, about what they did and what they didn't do, about pressure they put on journalists. And I think The Guardian, it's important that they would reflect and listen to questions, extremely damning questions the whole Western media has to answer. For example, about did you cover and centre the genocide and criminal intent, the statements made by Israeli leaders and officials? Have you treated Palestinian life as having the equal worth that human life should be treated with universally? Have you reported adequately on the atrocities that have been committed with the facilitation of the British state. And I know lots of people, you know, have asked very angry questions about that, which have to be listened to. And I think the right response there would not to be we're better than this or that media organisation, because the media environment in Britain is hideous. So, I mean, the bar is on the floor there, really, because, I mean, much of the press has just disseminated pro-Israel propaganda. It's on your own terms, You know, what have you covered, what haven't you covered, and what angles have you taken? And I think the Guardian should audit its coverage and listen to voices who are criticising it, specifically Palestinian voices, about that coverage, and make urgent changes when its own journalists and Palestinian voices are challenging it. That's absolutely critical. There will be a reckoning. I think it's really important people realise there's going to be a reckoning. This crime is too extreme and too shameless and too documented, and everyone will have to account for what they did in the British media. Every newspaper and every media outlet. And what I would say to everyone is, look yourself in the mirror, ask yourself, did I do everything I could? Did I accurately report on one of the great crimes of our age? I know the response is, well, look, this is the demands of activists, and, you know, journalism has to be impartial and so on. The point made by all journalists who are angry at their media outlets, the media outlets they work for, is that normal journalistic standards have not been applied to this subject. So you can see that in the BBC on a colossal scale. Due impartiality, all the rest of it has not been applied. And it's not good enough to say we're better than X, Y, or Z. You've got to account on your own terms about your own coverage. And I think actually, you know, I think it would be useful for the Guardian to be, because you know, obviously it's got a membership and, you know, 1 million members who pay for it, who I know, you know, would have their views on Palestine. I think we can guess. I think it would be useful to you know, to kind of just do an honest, transparent audit of that coverage and see what has to urgently change. Myself.
No. Many of my friends will think that you are giving a very diplomatic answer now. Okay. Owen, why do you think so many journalists in the mainstream media are reporting very badly on Palestine? What is the reason of their failure in the honest reporting on Palestine?
Firstly, the Western media is, in terms of if you look at the national media, is the second most privileged by background of any profession apart from medicine, according to the government's own statistics. So you get people from disproportionately privileged, privately educated establishment backgrounds who often just defer to the status quo, which they grew up benefiting from.
Yeah.
So I think that you can see that on domestic issues, obviously in quite a striking way, but I think that lends itself generally to a kind of sense of defence of the status quo, and that's because of things like, you know, obviously private school, but it's things like the decline of local newspapers, which gave a foot in the door often for working class journalists to then get to the national media, the rise of things like postgraduate journalism qualifications, which are not accessible to huge numbers of people because they're expensive, unpaid internships, often they go to, you know, you get that on your CV to get into the media. And that's often because you've got friends or family in the media already. And again, who can work for free in London? You know, lots of people can't afford to do that. So that's all helped to make it a closed shop for often for privileged people. The fact that much of the press is obviously run by right-wing media moguls, who obviously select journalists to reflect the ideological views of their newspapers. I mean, that's a massive issue, obviously. If you're someone who dissents from the status quo, then you're not going to end up working realistically for the Sun or the Mail or the Express or the Telegraph or the Times. I mean, so that's a huge issue. And then the BBC. Look, the BBC, its staff had to be vetted by the security services until the 1980s, and I'm not entirely convinced that, you know, that's it's not paranoid to suggest is that kind of thing still going on. But there's obviously certainly a vetting system which would not be good for people with dissenting views.
Yeah.
Well, generally though, there's that deference to the British establishment on foreign policy issues, that a sense of which a lot of those sorts of journalists have, which is Britain is a force for good in the world. It might make mistakes here and there, but we are a liberal democracy. A lack of understanding of Britain's past, in terms of its imperial and colonial past and the terrible crimes it committed all over the world, India, Kenya, Palestine. And a lack of, an ignorance often of just basic foreign policy issues. There's a kind of like, often a kind of contempt for understanding the world that we live in. It's just not something that's taken seriously. But specifically anti-Palestinian racism. It's clear that a lot of British journalists, this is unambiguously true, they see Israel and Israelis as us, as the West. And they see Palestinians as them. And that, it was very clear in terms of the 7th of October and the attacks there was seen as, for them, this is an attack on us, it's the attack on the West. That basically Israel is portrayed as another Western so-called liberal democracy. And yes, liberal democracies may have their flaws and make their mistakes, but whilst they're the kind of the barbarian hordes. BBC journalists, one of them put to me that in the BBC, you could sum up the view as Palestine is Russia and Israel is Ukraine, which is crazy, given Israel has occupied and invaded Palestine and colonised it on a systematic basis, as well as obviously instituting apartheid, and now committing genocide. I mean, it's the world turned on its head. But that's how you see it, because there was that sense of, Ukraine is us, Russia is them. But in this case, it's Palestine is them and Israel is us. They are people, they're people who live lifestyles that are similar or recognisable to us. Yeah. It's just crude racism, I'm afraid. It's crude, a lot of that. Obviously, there's a systemic thing at the top, which is Israel is a strategic ally of the West. Yeah. And it's an ally which we must defend. And that's a strategic, that's the systemic embedded view of the BBC. That's a BBC world view. Yeah. But the journalists themselves, there are those who do see Palestinians as equal human beings, but they're the dissenters. The others, they just don't see it. They feel an attack on an Israeli, they instinctively feel the emotional response you feel of an attack of someone who is like you. That's your empathy being turned on, your empathy nose. You hear an attack on, 100 Palestinians just got exterminated by an Israeli bomb, and that isn't being alerted because you're not seeing them as people like yourself, it's them. And that racism has sustained journalistic complicity in the systemic bias of the mainstream media.
I totally agree. Is cowardice also another factor? Because, on the 7th of October, we have seen all journalists from all around the world going there and report on what happens, as they should. But when it comes to Gaza, 2 years of genocide, and they did not force their way into Gaza. If I were the BBC, I would definitely force our reporters to go to the Gaza and report from Gaza. But none of the mainstream media managed to send journalists to Gaza and defy the Israeli rules of journalist embargo.
And just on that, it just made me think, a journalist told me, made a really important point, that after 7th of October, what happened is all the journalists descend and go to Israel, and then you basically get all the news coverage structured around developments in Israel, press conference here, a new development about what's happened on 7th of October, even as, weeks in, vast numbers of Palestinians have been murdered and maimed, and much of Gaza wiped from the face of the earth. But everything's revolving around what's happening in Israel and the lines they're disseminating, because they're camped out in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and not in Gaza. So that kind of underlines just how pernicious that was, actually. They made that point. It's something I didn't think about until they emphasised it to me. Yeah, I know a lot of journalists want to do that and want to go to Gaza, and they've made that clear. Alex Crawford at Sky News, who I think is one of the few journalists who's really come out very well out of this. The point she made was that early on, she got piled on, I saw at the time. She said Israel is forbidding journalists from getting into Gaza because they don't want the world to see the war crimes they're committing.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of them want to do that. I don't myself know what that actually, because you're right. I mean, people can get. I mean, obviously there were aid workers who've gone in and doctors who've managed to get in. So I don't know what that would involve. But you know, because one thing because we do have so many journalists in Gaza, they're Palestinian journalists. It's just I remember David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, just odious man, who said, you know, there aren't journalists in Gaza, and obviously there's a huge number of journalists. Diminishing because they keep getting murdered. But yeah, I think the Western media should have. I mean, the fact, as an example, they kept saying Hamas-run health ministry as standard to delegitimize, to undermine the official death figures. They should have woven in as standard Israel bans Western journalists from entering Gaza, but they should have done a massive, they should have just done a massive campaign over that issue, which would expose this outrage. At the very least, they should have done that. But they've actually kept very. They
could quote, for example, The Lancet, which said 186 Palestinians were killed, or the other journalist, I think.
Well, I mean, The Economist is a really good example. The Economist backed the genocide.
Yeah.
And The Economist did a study which found that, and these statistics are 3 months out of date.
Yeah.
That up to 109,000 Palestinians have died violent deaths in Gaza, which excludes the indirect deaths, which, as we know from, I hesitate to use conflict because it's a genocide, but it's difficult to just compare it to other, like Yemen, for example. In that, you know, I went to a Yemeni refugee camp. I wrote a lot about the Western facilitated war in Yemen and its terrible crimes. Most of those who are believed to have been killed died of indirect causes, not of direct violence. So we already know, you know, those figures. But the point I'm making is the international media should have kicked off in the most spectacular fashion about Israel banning them from entering. And, you know, but how did they respond to that? They responded by, instead, repeatedly kowtowing to Israeli lies. So you'll get articles about atrocities committed with the first, 3 paragraphs based around the denials from the IDF, which, despite the overwhelming evidence of Israel lying over and over again. They don't do that with Russia. They know that because they don't treat Russian authorities' denials as credible. Correct. But they don't do that with Israel. So instead what they did is so Israel goes, well, screw you, you're not letting in, we're not letting into Gaza. And the West was like, anyway, could you just feed us some lies? Or we'll just revolve our coverage around your obviously false claims, which will just keep churning out anyway. So they respond. So even though Israel actually just showed technically their total contempt for the Western media responded by showing deference and respect to liars committing genocide. The cowardice for me, the central cowardice, is the people who just don't speak out. That for me is, there's so many Western journalists who know a terrible evil has been committed, but they haven't said anything because they fear the consequences for their careers. They fear they'll get piled on and smeared, and guess what? That's true, by the way. That's rational. It's rational to think your career will be threatened if you speak out about the truth about Palestine. It's rational to think you'll be smeared, but you know what? You're not a Palestinian journalist getting blown up alongside your entire family. You're not a Palestinian journalist thinking every day, every last moment, every moment could be your last, and often it being your last.
What is your message for these people, these journalists, whether they were reporters or editors?
You're cowards, and history damns cowards. Cowardice is always a sin in the face of injustice. In the face of genocide, it's a moral crime. And every single atrocity, every single heinous crime in history has been made possible by the silent. It's not just the people who actively cheer on barbarism. No, anyone still supporting this genocide at this point, you just kind of have to ask yourself, are you sociopathic? And that's probably an easy answer because most people aren't sociopathic, and all great atrocities, you know, in history, it's comforting to think sociopaths are responsible. It's not how it works. But the people who are still silent, or, you know, and I'm not talking about empty platitudes. I'm not saying, you know, empty platitudes of, well, this is so sad and terrible, and yeah, Israel really needs it. No, I'm talking about calling this out for what it is, which is a crime of historic proportions, deferring to the work of genocide scholars, a consensus of genocide scholars, including Israeli genocide scholars, who have declared that this is a genocide. And those people are facilitating genocide. The silent journalists are facilitating a genocide, and history is going to damn them. I think they think, well, you know what? We'll get away with the reckoning because people can't point to this or that, and we didn't go, cheering on the IDF. But history will have to record the silence because we're keeping receipts, and people need to know that the receipts are being kept. Yeah. Journalists are keeping receipts about who did what and who didn't do what, who didn't speak out when they could have done. And those people are going to get exposed. And absolutely no question about that. Everyone needs to know that now. You're going to get exposed if you didn't speak out, or you just used empty platitudes when you could have used your platform to call out one of the worst crimes of our age. So, anyone who facilitates genocide has to face a reckoning, in my view.
And you have been vocal about this genocide from the beginning, Owen. And allow me to ask you, have there been any attempts to silence you, threaten you, make you stop reporting on Gaza?
Yes. I can't go... Yes, I have. I mean, that's true with anyone who speaks out about Palestine. I'm still standing.
Will you fall?
I'm still standing. I mean, I think, look, in time, people, I think, will understand. I don't want to center myself either because, obviously, I am still standing. I mean, look, first off, I've been blacklisted by most TV channels. So I don't... Yeah, I used to appear on lots of... But, I knew that would happen. It's... When this genocide began, I just made a pact with myself, which is, it's obvious what is going to happen. There is literally no point in having a platform of the sort you have unless you use it to oppose an obvious heinous crime. On October the 9th, 2023, in response to Yoav Gallant declaring that Israel is imposing a total siege in Gaza, no water, energy will get in because we are fighting human animals, I wrote, this is genocidal language, because it was genocidal language. That's what I tweeted on the 9th of October. And then, in those coming days, and in those tweets, I said, it is obvious that a crime of historic proportions is going to be committed, and everyone who supported this will face a reckoning. And the reason I did that is not because I had any special insight, or, there are people who are far more versed on the history of Palestine than I am. I'm not a scholar, I'm not a genius, I'm not a prophet. I just took literally what Israeli leaders and officials said. I pointed to the atrocities that were being committed from day one and had been committed, not just from the Nakba and before and after, but in October 2023, which before 7th October, 240 Palestinians, including over 40 kids, had been murdered by the Israeli state and Israeli settlers with the connivance of the Israeli state. And I went on Sky News on the 10th of October 2023, and I went on with Margaret Hodge. And, I pointed to not only the crimes being committed against the Palestinians, what they'd gone through, but what they were going through as we were speaking. That Palestinian children were being exterminated as we spoke. And Margaret Hodge shouted me down and said, this is your obsession, and treated it as though it was like an indecent attack on the victims of 7th October, whatever. I mean, it was just ridiculous. The point I make is, it's obvious what was going to happen, and my view is I just wouldn't forgive myself, I wouldn't be able to look myself in the mirror, so that's kind of, I think, sufficient to kind of... Because when you've got moral clarity in the face of a terrible evil, it gives you such protection.
Yes.
Because you just know. Like, there's things in my life where I look back and have made, and I'm not sure about the time, or, this could go one way or the other. It's obvious what happens. This goes down in history as one of the worst possible crimes. And that, to me, was absolutely obvious from the beginning, and I wrote that at the time. And therefore, I just felt you have a responsibility because I have a platform. I'm there to dissent from the status quo, but I have a platform in a Western media which is facilitating the crime, and my government is facilitating the crime. So you have a responsibility. Now, did I then get lots of attempts to threaten my job and career and to try and... Yes, obviously, yeah. But have I been blacklisted from most TV channels? Yes. But good, fine. I don't go on TV for the hell of it. You know, some people, that's the problem. A lot of journalists who want to go on TV because they're like, you know, they want their face on TV.
Yeah.
You can tell often who those people are because they've got pictures of themselves on TV as their Twitter banner and stuff. Always be suspicious of those people. But I just think, you know, I just think that it's there for a purpose. You're there to do something. And I don't care, you know, fine, I don't go on, I'm not on the BBC or Sky News very much anymore, but, you know, what would be the point of me going on if I'm not doing my job?
Well, the good thing is that so many people are realizing this fact among the common people, not only the journalists, and as a result of the mainstream media bias and the lack of a trust in the mainstream media right now, we can see a new media outlets are emerging.
Like this.
Zateo, like Palestine Deep Dive, and even Novara Media is flourishing. Double Down in News is doing amazing. And more platforms will emerge because no one trusts the BBC and Sky News and Fox News in America. No one trusts these outlets. And that's why my understanding and my realization right now, enough with attacking the mainstream media, and it's time to build our own media.
I agree.
People-powered media. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. And I think with every passing day, more people join us. We're supported by the people here in Palestine Deep Dive. Why would people donate to us? Normal, average people, £10 a month or £20 a month. It's because they really need to hear different voices.
And you're doing their job. I mean, you're doing an incredible job here, so that's why. And you're meeting a need which exists because there is a vacuum left by the mainstream media. I mean, this.
But it's very sad because the BBC should do that. We should not have this.
It's absurd.
We shouldn't need me as a genocide survivor. I did not need to do this media. The BBC should have done it. Sky News should have done it.
Do you know what you're doing?
Yeah.
What a lot of people, through the content, because they can from the, you know, the platforming of the voices and the exposing of crimes, which you're right, the BBC should be exposing, but it is educating a whole new generation. And a lot of those now, there are people watching your content who are like teenagers,
Yeah.
and or in the early 20s or whatever. In 10, 20 years, those people are going to become incredible journalists because of that content. And I think that's really important to note. There is actually this politicization. When I was a lad, I'm a geriatric millennial. I'm 40 years old. But when I was growing up in Stockport.
You look 10 years younger than me.
I'll tell you. Well, I didn't.
Not
That's definitely not true. That's definitely not true. Macaulay Culkin maybe after he overdid it. No, but I think when I grew up in Stockport, and the kind of at the time, the kind of prevailing sense was like younger people were apathetic. And it was this weird time because it was the most stable period in the West in its history, pretty much. It was after the end of the Cold War, and you got the Western triumphalism. And, you know, you had this economic boom which was based on a mirage because of the financial bubble, and that all went bang. But it was before, you know, the catastrophes of Iraq and Afghanistan, and people were not politicised.
Yeah.
And what has
Definitely.
shifted because of obviously the horrors of the world is a lot of younger people, you know, are infinitely more politicised. Because there's everything from, I mean, you know, what's interesting, because this happened with like the climate emergency, for example. Amongst younger people now, Palestine is becoming, even people who are not politically that generally engaged, but there's a kind of general sensibility about it. These aren't people who've read lots of books about Palestine, but they've engaged with content, for example, like your content on Instagram and so on. And it has not just educated them about Palestine, it's helped cement a broader worldview, which is about the role of the West and the need to distrust and fight the media elites and the political elites. I mean, it's the worst possible education because obviously we're talking about the mass extermination of people. But it has, and that's the work of Palestine. It's the work of Palestinians like yourself. I mean, Palestine is setting people free.
That's the work of Israel as well, because they have killed so many children that no one can forget what Israel has done. And that's a new movement. Palestine now has become a universal, international movement. Yeah. And you know, before the genocide, I was always like an active member in the Palestine movement in the UK. And I was always annoyed that all those who attend the meetings and the protests are older people. But now after the genocide, more and more younger people come forward. You know, a few months ago, I spoke at in Sheffield. 400
That's
people
wonderful.
were there, yeah, with Jeremy Corbyn. And so many young people came to this event, and they came to me, they approached me, and they told me they are now more aware about Palestine, and they want to be active members of the Palestine movement in the UK. And that is a precedent. That is amazing. That gives me a message that the future is Palestinian.
It is. Look, I mean, because we talk about standing with the Palestinian people to free the people of Palestine, but I mean, Palestinians are freeing people in the West because they're liberating them from the, I guess, often the naivety or the kind of passive acceptance of a status quo, which isn't just broken at home in terms of the misery and insecurity imposed on so many people, but I think people think, when you realise that your elites are facilitating a genocide, they've lost their legitimacy. Do you see what I mean? You don't. Yeah. It's not like here's a scandal involving a politician, or here's a politician who's broken their promises no, they facilitated a genocide. And once you realise that, because one of the obstacles has been, I think, during this genocide, is a lot of people, they see the horrors and the evil, and just the barbarism, but they kind of think to themselves, well, if it's really that bad, then why aren't the grown-ups who are in charge? Surely they would act. And that stops people, it's almost this passive acceptance people often have, or kind of, sometimes kind of naive kind of belief that I might agree or disagree with people running the country, but surely, like, they're serious people and they've got some moral compass, and, so that people don't see it in the kind of systemic way of who the society is rigged in favour of and who it isn't. It's not about how good or nice the person happens to be on a personal level. It's about the system they're in. But I think, what this has done is make people realise, well, hold on a minute. If the people running the country can arm and facilitate a genocide, then they don't have. Firstly, they should be in prison, but they have no right to be running the country, and you can't trust them in anything. And I think you can see that at the moment. For example, I think in New York with Zoran Mamdani, that phenomenon where he beat the Democratic Party establishment, Andrew Cuomo, one of the pillars of the establishment, and there's no question that obviously a broken economic system, which in New York causes a housing crisis and a crisis of cost of living, is a huge part of that. But
Palestine is part.
Palestine's a big part of that. Palestine, because it's made people just think, you've forfeited your right to rule. You don't have a right to rule. And people realise, well, hold on a minute. If they can facilitate that, then what else is going on here? I think so. It's
and especially in New York.
I know.
With the biggest Jewish population outside of Tel Aviv.
And many of those younger Jews are the same. Younger Jewish Americans are people supporting Mamdani. It's really interesting. A poll over a year ago. That was over a year ago. It was done by a right-wing pro-Israel think tank, and it found that 30% of Jewish Americans overall think Israel's committing genocide, but it rose to nearly 40% amongst those under 45. And then if you go down to people in their 20s, I mean, they didn't obviously, but the younger and younger you got as a Jewish American, the more likely you were to think Israel is committing a genocide. And you can see that the polling of, lots of those Jewish New Yorkers went out and voted for Mamdani, and they voted for Mamdani partly because of Palestine. They voted partly because Palestine has politicised. You can see that here in this country. There's so, like with NAMOD and stuff, and, we've both been to NAMOD events, Jewish Peace Movement, of younger, that should panic the Israeli state, because they obviously try and present themselves as the Jewish state and provide, offer in terms of legitimacy through the diaspora abroad and so on. But, I interviewed Gideon Levy a few times, the Israeli journalist who's spoken out about, obviously, the crimes committed by the state for a very long time. Quite a lonely voice in Israel.
Yeah.
But he thinks that things shift because of America in particular, and he notes the number of Jewish Americans, younger Jewish Americans who are shifting. It is just changing people. So people have been changed forever. I do kind of, you kind of think to yourself, how can you not be changed forever by this?
Yeah, but one of the change that we're seeing is that recently Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana announced that they will start their new Lift party in the UK. What is your view on that?
I think it's a really good, healthy development. I think, look, the Labour Party is dead in my view. I quit the Labour Party a year and a half ago I joined the Labour Party as a 15-year-old. My mum got me a Labour Party membership when I was my 15th birthday, and I was such a loser. But my parents met through, you know, they were Labour. They were. I mean, my parents. My parents are more left-wing than me. They met as Trotskyists through the militant tendency. My dad was a South Yorkshire organiser of the militant tendency, but they met outside Tootingbeck Station in 1968 for outside of it was a left-wing pro-Labour rally or whatever. Very romantic. You know, my grandmother was a Labour councillor. My great-granddad was on the Independent Labour Party football team in the 1930s.
Wow.
I worked for John McDonnell in my early 20s, who's obviously the shadow chancellor under Jeremy Corbyn. I think, you know, for me it was a case of, a lot of it was just basic strategy, which is, it's not just everything from, you know, Keir Starmer being a lying, like what the most deceitful politician of our time. You know, I mean, people go, oh, what about Boris Johnson? Boris Johnson lied as easily as he breathed. I'm not denying that. But he didn't run for Tory leader on a hard Brexit platform and then take Britain as the customs union single market, did he? So, you know, he stood on a platform of public ownership, taxing the rich to invest, scrapping tuition fees, defending the welfare state, defending migrants' rights, and putting human rights at the heart of foreign policy and and reviewing all arms sales and so on. I mean, what an absolute joke. Scrapped all of that and then attacked the left on a, you know, purged Jeremy Corbyn, you know, suspended after the genocide began Labour MPs who spoke out against the genocide. When disproportionately Muslim Labour councillors were resigning over Keir Starmer backing Israel's right to institute a siege against the people of Gaza, which he then gaslit people about repeatedly afterwards. And they left in disgust. His aide briefed a journalist, a stooge journalist, that Labour's shaking off the fleas. And then, you know, Keir Starmer said, if you don't like our changes, you know where the door is. Well, fine, okay, see you then. After the election, they attack elderly people, they attack disabled people, they suspend 7 Labour MPs who vote against the 2-child benefit cap, which drives hundreds of thousands of kids into poverty and hardship. Literally, what was the point of the Labour Party if it imposes poverty on people? 2 of those they didn't restore the whip to. One is John McDonnell, my former boss. The other is Zava Sultana. They want us gone anyway, but they've just shut down democratic means. They purge. They put their drones. They parachute their drones into the seats. So, you know, even if people thought the Labour Party could be changed in the future, that would only happen if there was a massive left party outside putting pressure on it, like with UKIP and the Brexit Party with the Conservatives. That was changed. I still think that, you know, those people who run the Labour Party would prefer like death than to let the left anywhere near. And they hate the left more than they hate the Tories. They hate the left more than they hate the right. They regard this as mortal enemies. And my view is they are mortal enemies because they're facilitating a genocide. So, you know, there's no... So when I left the Labour Party then, because what I did then is because I knew an election was coming, obviously, was I helped set up something called We Deserve Better, which then funded both Green Party candidates and independent candidates, including Jeremy Corbyn's campaign, of course. But now the problem we've got is we're fragmented because you've got the Green Party who won 4 seats and then came second in 39 seats. Zach Polanski standing to be leader of the Green Party. He's a brilliant guy, opposes genocide, very much on the left. And then you've got, you know, the independents with MPs who elected, one of them being Jeremy Corbyn, there's 5 of them. And then you've got left-wing Labour MPs. And I just think that has to... What is obviously going to happen is this party is going to be set up and then it will have a pact with the Green Party because the last thing we want is left-wing candidates to stand against each other and split. But this is really important because, you know, people say, oh, well, it's splitting the vote and letting Reform win. Reform will win because of Keir Starmer and his agenda. That's who's driving people into the arms of Nigel Farage because there's not an alternative. Yeah. And at the moment, that just means politics is about who can kick migrants harder. You know, it's not about why aren't we taxing the rich to invest in the economy or why are we committing genocide, why are we perpetrating a genocide. It's all about making life harder and politics becoming uglier and nastier. So I just think we need to get our act together. And I just think this is a really important development. And I hope what it does is it comes into being and then forms a pact with a Green Party that I hope is led by Zach Polanski. I think it will be. And and then just throws everything at loads of seats. I mean, I don't know what, for example, the relationship needs to work out with as well. Take Leanne Mohammed, who stood against Wes Streeting, awful Blairite health secretary, nearly won, within 500 votes. I mean, I went and supported her and stuff, and I kind of think, oh my God, I wish we'd done more. It's just like, But yeah, I did a video with her at the time and stuff, I mean, she's incredible. Would she join a new party? Would she stand as independent? I don't know. But, you have to, because some might think, well, actually, in my community, it's better to be to be an independent candidate. But so that has to be sorted out, because you can't have people standing against each other. It'd be a nightmare. And then Labour comes through the middle, or Reform. But I think it's really important that we have a broad alliance, which is a broad church of people who agree on taxing the rich, investing in the economy, scrapping tuition fees, public ownership, workers' rights, and taking on the climate emergency, and having a foreign policy based on peace and justice, rather than genocide and murder.
One of the major reasons why Corbyn was destroyed last time, it was due to anti-Semitism campaign against him. And I know you were vocal at that time about the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. And I want to ask you, if time goes back, would you do something differently or not?
I mean, sometimes when this comes up, I sometimes get frustrated just because, not with you obviously, but with other people, in that I think what I said and did is very much misconstrued, because I always defended Jeremy Corbyn from the accusations of anti-Semitism and got attacked viciously for doing so. I mean, during the general election of 2019, I had a protest organised against me. Placards calling me an anti-Semite. I had people running after me, videoing me, yelling that I was an anti-Semite. It got inundated with death threats. Being, at a time when, I was being targeted by the far right, or beaten up by a far right extremist. So, for example, what I would do is, for example, in the position I took was, I called it walking and chewing gum. And I set that out in a Medium article at the time. I wrote on a Medium piece setting out my view, which was any claim that Jeremy Corbyn or people around him are anti-Semitic is a smear, which is based on nothing. They're anti-racism campaigners who fought racism all their lives. The vast majority of the Labour membership abhor anti-Semitism, and there is a fringe of people who are anti-Semitic who are not representative of the broader membership. That was the view I took. So, for example, I guess sometimes the reason I did get frustrated with some of the things people said about this is I would go on TV and radio to defend the leadership on these claims. So, for example, the Sunday Times in 2018 did this attack dossier where it's just ridiculous looking back actually, where it was about Facebook groups where they observed anti-Semitic content being posted, and they noted in these Facebook groups where, it'd be like a Facebook group like I Support Jeremy Corbyn with like tens of thousands of people, and some of the people in the leader's office were in it. So then I went on TV to denounce this as completely ludicrous and an outrage, and said, why aren't you going after racist conservative politicians, blah, blah, blah. And, I had an argument with the same with Panorama when that came out, which was the hatchet job on Labour at the time. And the reason, if I'm honest, that I was going on TV and radio, and I then did the same thing with that documentary in terms of the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn being based on nothing. If I'm brutally honest, it's because the shadow cabinet ministers refused to do so. So they didn't go on TV or radio, which is why people like myself ended up doing that. And I guess sometimes the reason I get frustrated is I supported some of the actions that Jeremy Corbyn took, and Jenny Formby, who was the chair of the General Secretary of the Labour Party, who was an ally of his. And what they did, contrary to the narrative, was they speeded up, they changed the disciplinary process and speeded it up to take action against people. And what I would then say in media interviews is, well, actually, contrary to what you're saying, they're actually taking more action than not. But that meant, they took action against people which people now are angry about, which I defended. And I guess the reason I find that a bit sometimes Kafkaesque is the argument is that I'm being attacked for supporting action that Jeremy Corbyn and Jenny Formby took, which obviously I wasn't taking. But I did defend. But I think the very legitimate critique, which I would, because I mean that's the thing. So first, I did routinely defend. I mean, I went to defend the leadership on that basis, on the basis of that it was. You know, that my formula was that is a smear to say they're anti-Semitic. And I was called anti-Semitic for doing that. Because I went on, for example, during the general election campaign in 2019, and this came up, and I said it's a smear to say Jeremy Corbyn was anti-Semitic, and then it came back with, but the vast majority of people who are Jewish in Britain think he's anti-Semitic, so you're therefore basically I was implying that I'm being anti-Semitic by refusing to accept the views and lived experience of Jewish people. And whatever that polling said or whatever, it's not how it works. So I remember, you know, knocking on doors and voters who happened to be British Indian by origin, older members, older voters generally, who were denouncing Jeremy Corbyn as a terrorist. And when I asked why, it's because Labour had supported Kashmiri national self-determination, which I support. They might, and you know, and that was presented by certain organisations, pro-Modi organisations, as Hindu phobia and Hindu. Yeah. They might say that, and they might think it, actually, but it's not true. I think the difficulty was, in terms of how it framed it, was that I think people felt that what I should have done, and others should have done with our platform, is go out fighting in a way that the leadership they were frustrated with didn't do, which was to say this is a smear campaign by pro-Israel racists. Because obviously what happened, and we can see it, some of those people who led that smear, that led the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn in particular, you can see during the genocide their perspectives and their views. They support the genocide, and they're anti-Palestinian racists, and they were upheld as the arbiters of what racism and not. And what I should have done, the argument goes, is to take them on and to fight and to expose them for who they are. That would have been very difficult, in my view, because it was, at the time, obviously very hard making the case that I tried to make about, which was the walking and chewing gum position. And I just think, as someone who, you know, and people might find this frustrating, but someone who isn't Jewish then saying, well, this is nonsense, but it would have just been very difficult. And it was difficult at the time as well because, there were lots of Jewish leftists who supported Jeremy Corbyn who didn't, that's not the position they took publicly. So it was a case of, you know, I think the point is, and I think it's very correct, is so many of those people who led that campaign, it was a bad faith smear campaign against someone they objected to over their support for Palestine. I mean, and I think, looking back, because what I kept doing is defensive ad hoc things. So, for example, the Wreathgate, take Wreathgate. So I wrote this article. This was over one of the biggest attacks during 2018, basically, and that was Jeremy Corbyn had gone to Tunis to commemorate victims of the Israeli airstrike on the PLO. And then the argument was that, I can't remember, that a wreath was laid for one of the architects of Black September. And so I wrote an article saying Wreathgate is an exercise in hypocrisy. And I noted, so what I did is I went through as best I could to expose, well, firstly, they're talking about the PLO, which has been was accepted as legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people in 1992. So it's trying to turn that on its head. And whilst British figures have laid wreaths and paid testament to Israeli war criminals. And I wrote that piece, and at the time, I mean, because I also did this thread about it, and I said, I went through the hypocrisy of all that. People obsessing over a wreath whilst the West is supporting and facilitating these crimes abroad. And I noted, for example, the Saudi war in Yemen at the time, which was armed by the West. And I said, no one's ever been killed by a wreath. And that became a totemic attack on me, which some people, like pro-Israel people in their profiles and all the rest of it. What I make is, so I did those sorts of defences, but it was very ad hoc. It was kind of in response to this attack or that attack or this attack or that attack. And obviously, I mean, we still don't know, you know, I guess in terms of how that was all coordinated, that will come out, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Because it felt at the time, from the Labour leadership's perspective, that it was like a grid, where it was like, here's a story, here's another one, which is intended to destabilise them during the summer 2018. Because the same thing during IRA, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance definition of anti-Semitism, which included two examples in particular, which basically helped shut down critique of Israel. Because what I did then is I did a video with The Guardian with a Palestinian British lawyer to go through the problems with. So what I tried to do at the time, it was ad hoc and defensive.
Yeah.
But it's not, I guess I would get frustrated with this. I think people argue that what I'd never said at the time was that there was grounds for the claims against Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, which I always said were split. There's literally not a single piece of evidence of me saying anything other than that's an attack on them, that's a smear, that's, you know. But people feel that I should have exposed this as a smear campaign designed to destabilise him. And I think what would have been better, although at the time, you know, it would have needed a huge amount of resources, is to spend time doing a clinical, investigative piece of journalism. But if I have to be honest, and I'll just be honest about it, at the time, just doing all those appearances on TV and the radio and those articles, when I felt that shadow cabinet members were not doing that, was hard, actually. I mean, I'm not trying to get a violin out, but it was because I was just getting called an anti-Semite all the time like everybody else on the left. And so it felt at the time like it was just like getting, you know, constantly making these interventions and getting a load of shit thrown at you. And then, obviously, when I backed Jeremy Corbyn taking, and I'm not going to go action against certain individuals, then people saying, well, you're now part of the smear campaign. But it's like, well, I'm backing action taken by the leadership. But I think it's absolutely right that I should have, that, however difficult that might have felt, and obviously when you've got literal protests being organised against you and calling you an anti-Semite, which is what happened in Brent in 2019, you kind of think, you know, it felt very difficult. And obviously it's intended to destabilise people on the left, because anti-racism so core to your identity. And that's what happened to Jeremy. It was very destabilising for him. They knew that, because obviously he was racist, so being smeared as a racist was extremely nightmarish and caused him a lot of, you know, trauma, which then didn't help, to be honest. And I just think we should have gone, well, actually, this is what's going on, and so on. But it was, I mean, that's a long answer, but that's my slightly defensive answer, I suppose.
Thank you for that. Okay, the following questions I ask every one of my guests, okay? I always ask people, what is their view on Zionism? So I really would like to hear from you. What is your view on Zionism? And what is your view on liberal Zionism as well?
I think we just have to look at how Zionism was thought up and then put into practice, which was obviously innately influenced by colonialism and the idea of here is land which belongs to those, to the settlers, and this land no longer belongs to indigenous people. And therefore it's based on obvious notions of ethnic superiority. And, you know, and I think this is something that I guess I struggle about talking about, in that I think I felt sometimes, and this is something which is definitely part of my self-critique, is I worried about how I would discuss this, in that because so many Jewish people would regard themselves as Zionist, but then have differing views on what that meant for Palestinian national self-determination. And then you had people, like, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, his leader of the Labour Party, said he supported a two-state solution. I mean, I think probably his views would have evolved that. And obviously he was a big champion of Palestinian rights. And then people would go, well, you know, this is something that, you know, when John Landsman was, because he helped found Momentum and helped run Jeremy Corbyn's first leadership campaign. And I guess what influenced me thinking about that at the time was he'd go, well, then you'd say Jeremy Corbyn's a Zionist because of that, so therefore it becomes an unhelpful label. And I think, you know, I think sometimes a lot of my views were about, well, how... Because when I went on Question Time in 2011, like the first kind of cut-through video appearance or media appearance I had was about Gaza in 2012. It was about when Israel was attacking Gaza. And then I was asked, you know, my views on what would happen next, and I suggested either you have a one-state solution with equal rights for all or a two-state solution and all the rest of it. And my view was always, well, it's not my position to determine the future of the Palestinian people and how that is negotiated and all the rest of it. But I think, you know, my fear was always, my worry was, you know, is it used in a... This was something which came up, I remember when Jeremy Corbyn came into attack and the way he framed it at the time, which was that it was a term he used less because of how some people abused it, basically. And that ended up being like my fear, I guess. You know, when people threw around like the word Zio or whatever. But I think the reason that my views have evolved and changed on that is Zionism is a political ideology and which has not been critiqued in the way it should have been because of how critiques of that have been falsely defined as anti-Semitism. But Zionism in practice means notions of ethnic superiority for those who are settlers, with the indigenous population cast as inferior and indeed to be purged from their own land. And that's what Zionism meant in practice. It has meant the Nakba and the mass expulsion of the Palestinian people from their land in a murderous fashion. It has meant apartheid. It has meant the longest belligerent military occupation in modern times, the longest siege of our time. You know, 1 million Palestinians incarcerated. You know, so then liberal Zionism becomes this idea that, you know, you can have a human version of that, but it always means an ethno-state in practice.
Yeah.
How can it not mean an ethno-state? And yes, you could say, well, it's become a more, you know, because as Gideon Levy, who I cited before, pointed out, who created the occupation? The so-called liberal Zionists. It wasn't Likud, who set up the occupation, and what we know as apartheid. It was actually the liberal, the progressive, the sort of left wing of Zionism. And I just think, I think it's possible to take into account, I mean, this is what I always worried about, which is how you engage with the collective trauma that many Jewish people feel about 2,000 years of persecution and the Holocaust and the attempt to exterminate them. That doesn't mean overriding, in terms of how you talk about things, the lived experience of Palestinians, which has been, in practice, Zionism has just meant, you know, ethnic cleansing, land theft, occupation, siege, mass murder. That's what it is in practice, and you can't humanise ideas of ethnic superiority in an ethno-state. It's not possible to do that, and which is why I support a one-state solution with equal rights for all. I mean, the idea that's kind of radical is ridiculous. It's obviously should. I mean, I'm a socialist. I'm not a liberal, but if you're just abiding by basic liberal precepts, the idea that it's extreme to support a state with equal rights for all, and that is absurd. It's just giving an opt-out. Because obviously, if that was applied anywhere else, that wouldn't be a controversy. And I don't accept that Jewish safety is tied to the existence of Israel. I think the opposite. I mean, just on that, you know, where are you more likely to have suffered a violent death as a Jewish person since 1948? Britain or Israel? The US or Israel? And, you know, another key point, Argentina in the 1970s, run by a right-wing military dictatorship, which targeted Jewish Argentinians disproportionately, killed by army officers doing Hitler salutes. Israel armed that dictatorship. So this idea that, you know, here, you know, we're this protector of Jewish safety around the world is a lie. So I don't accept, obviously, the basic argument. And I guess what I've always worried about is this, it's not my lane, therefore it's not for me to say these things. But in doing that, actually what I'm doing is saying, well, then I can't listen and amplify to Palestinian perspectives. And that's wrong. So that's something I've obviously evolved on. And I think, obviously, my view on Zionism is it's not a reformable project. You have to have a state based on equal rights. And that means the end of the Zionist political project.
Wow.
Sorry.
Many liberal Zionists personalize the problem to Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich. What is your view on that? Is our problem Netanyahu and his government?
No, it's funny. I remember with there's a headline. It was they changed it, so it's perfectly fine. But my editors, you know, I'd written a column and they kind of put Netanyahu, and I said, take that, please take that. It's Israel. I'm talking about the Israeli state here, not because it is a very useful bogeyman. I mean, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in particular, because Britain has imposed sanctions against them. Whoopie-doo. Because it's so useful to go, well, these are the bogeymen, these are the problems. Note how those sanctions have been imposed, justified on the basis of their comments about the West Bank. Interesting that, isn't it? Because they didn't do actions, either the West Bank or Gaza, because that would then implicate and incriminate the British state. But it's so easy to go, well, look at that, you know, they're pantomime villains, listen, and I'm not saying they're not genocidal criminal maniacs who deserve to be in prison, which they absolutely should be. But they're not the problem. It's a systemic issue. You have, if you build an ethno-state, which is based on ideas of ethnic superiority, then that's, you get uglier versions, but it's an uglier version of a systemic problem. That's the issue, it's systemic. It's not workable. I mean, what's happened is, essentially, you just end up with the logical conclusion of an ethno-state. Because what happens is, you get an ethno-state, and it steals the lands of indigenous people. Indigenous people don't want their land to be stolen. And then you get, obviously, forms of resistance and violence. And then you get this process where those who are settling and taking that land, who already have dehumanised, by definition, you have to dehumanise. I mean, that's what colonialism does. British colonialism did it all the time. You have to, you know, they had all these pseudo-scientists go to Africa to go, well, they're inferior, they're not intelligent, and pseudo-anthropologists to build a whole basis of dehumanisation. So you have to think they're not really human. And then when you get resistance and forms of violence, then you dehumanise even more, because then they're not just inferior or lazy or feckless or stupid, but they're barbarians. And then you think, you institute then, as the British did and all the other colonial enterprises did, far more lethal, vicious violence, but your violence is morally pure. Your violence is legitimate. Their violence is always backward and sadistic, which is why, because with the 7th of October, where war crimes are obviously undoubtedly committed, why was there a focus? Because this is what the Al Jazeera documentary investigated 7th of October said. They said the focus was on war crimes that didn't happen rather than ones that did. Why is that? Because people go, well, you know, the pro-Israel defenders, why are you picking apart? Why does it matter? It's like, if it doesn't matter, why are you talking about crimes that didn't exist? Why would you do that? The reason is because the gap between the actual war crimes Hamas committed in 7th of October and the war crimes being committed on a mass scale by the Israeli state, that gap isn't there. Like, Israel has committed far worse war crimes on a far more destructive and lethal scale. That's just a fact. But that's why you bring up beheading babies, because what's worse than beheading a baby? Like, literally, you can't really think of anything else. A lie, total lie, propagated, because these are barbarians. And that is the obvious logical conclusion of settler colonialism, because you have to present them, you have to justify your subjugation of them and your worse violence by the fact they are inferior. There is literally no other way of facilitating settler colonialism. It's not possible. So it's embedded in it's a feature, it's not a bug. And you can make it, you know. So what happens is you get this, you know, it becomes a hothouse effect. And Israel, because it's got impunity, there's nothing to put a lid on it. It's just pushing at an open door. And you can see that, you know, it's happening in other, you know, I often bring up the Serb experience, the Bosnian Serb nationalism of the 1990s. The Serbs were victims of the genocide under the Nazis. They suffered under the Croat Nazi collaborators, Ustashi, who were so barbaric, the Nazis thought they were too extreme. And the Serb forces would point to the crimes committed against them by the Nazis and the atrocities that were committed against them in Bosnia. Lots of Serb civilians suffered terrible massacres. But it was all. But the problem is, you have this lethal combination of victimhood based on actual. It's not without foundation. Combined with ethnic superiority is a really lethal combination.
Yeah,
it's like you are only the victim, but you are also superior, and your actual victims are inferior and dangerous, and that's inevitably embedded in this project. So you can't. So when you say, Netanyahu, people talk about Netanyahu, it's like, look at Israeli public opinion. Like, just look at the polls. I mean, 60% consistently have opposed all humanitarian aid getting to Gaza. Well, that's just mass death. In the beginning of, when Gaza had been wiped from the face of the earth already, the polling of Jewish Israelis showed that they were almost equally divided between people who thought enough firepower was being used and not enough firepower was being used, with 1.5% saying that too much firepower was being used. And that is what that is. It's not because there's anything inherent to being Jewish or Israeli. It's nothing to do with that. It's to, so many of their ancestors were Jewish left-wingers who did not support Zionism.
Yeah.
It's to do with the genocidal mania is the logical end point of settler colonialism. And it's radicalised much of the population in a hothouse effect. And that's not, like, Netanyahu is just the obvious expression of that. I mean, if he didn't win the election and one of the opposition leaders won, the same thing would have happened. The same thing would carry on happening. They've made clear they support this genocide. They've not dissented. At the moment you've got an opposition, I think Yair Lapid, but was it Golan? I can't remember which one. But he's saying he's the concentration camp they're openly talking about. He's just quibbling over cost. So it's part of the system, and you get a settler colonial system. You inevitably get dehumanisation to justify it, and then the end point is where we're at now, which is, well, actually, they're an existential threat. Their continued presence is an existential threat, and we will never be able to realise what are insatiable demands, by the way, for expansion, because, I mean, Smotrich, talks about expanding to Damascus. I mean, that insatiable demand, backed with impunity, means they will just keep on going until all Palestinians are removed from all of the land that they want, which actually could expand, to way beyond
Palestine.
Of course, Lebanon, Syria. So yeah, it's very important they're not bogeymen. They're products of a system, and they'll be worse than Netanyahu. That's the direction of travel.
Yeah. I would like to end you with this question. I often, when I meet with politicians or journalists like Piers Morgan, I always end with asking them this question. If you were a Palestinian, what would you do? What advice would you give the Palestinians now?
Well, it's not for me to lecture, is it? Because it depends. Which Palestinians are we talking about and where and... Because I support,
Because, we Palestinians, we have tried everything. We have tried calling for the one-state solution at the beginning of the Palestine Liberation Organization. It did not work. Then we agreed to the two-state solution. It did not work. We did the negotiations with Israel for 30 years. It did not work. We tried the armed resistance. It did not work. Nothing that we have tried as Palestinians worked. So what should we do? Or if you were a Palestinian, what would you do?
Well, because the only thing, I'm not trying to cop out, it's just like, there's Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, in, the 1948 borders of Israel, the diaspora. But I do think the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which is obviously a Palestinian-led resistance movement, is actually achieving a huge amount at the moment. I think what we're seeing a wave of boycotts, which are more popular than ever, divestments, like the Co-op in Britain, for example, recently divested. So that movement is actually getting bigger and bigger. And I do think the only way this can possibly end is with Israel turning into a pariah state, where Western states no longer arm and facilitate the subjugation of the Palestinian people. I can't see any other way of doing that. There's not a military solution to this. I mean, there's obviously been attempts at that in any case now, since and before Israel was founded. I mean, that's you know, whatever people think about armed struggle or whatever, that just hasn't succeeded. But boycott, divestment, sanctions, in terms of building mass movements across the West, which strangle Israel's ability to subjugate the Palestinian people, because that obviously works with apartheid South Africa. I know it's different because it's not like the West was dying in a ditch in the same way. And South Africa, apartheid South Africa obviously committed terrible crimes, but it didn't attempt genocide. Yeah. But I just think building that movement, led by Palestinian voices, is just that's educated me so much, but it's educated so many other people. And I think that collective power has more potential than ever. But it's not for me, obviously, to lecture Palestinians.
It's not lecturing. No, it's like my question was, in other words, what was your theory of a change?
Yeah, but BDS. I mean, that's for I just think that is achieving that movement for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions is achieving more than it's ever done. And I think because public opinion is shifting so dramatically, because it's not long since the genocide began in the grand scheme of things. I mean, obviously it's forever for people who suffered it, but in terms of what it's already done to change people's attitudes, I mean, the fact that 70% of people think Israel is committing war crimes in Britain, despite the media, and want an arms embargo and want Benjamin Netanyahu arrested. The only thing stopping it, obviously, from being acted on in terms of that movement is the terrorising of people by the media and by politicians, fearing that they'll get arrested and their careers will be ruined and they'll be smeared and demonised and turned into pariahs. That's what we fear. But actually that is weakening. And so is anti-Palestinian racism. It's still very strong, but Israeli impunity is collapsing. It's not anywhere near over by any stretch, but it's much weaker than it was. And the fear people have is subsiding given the scale of the crime. So I do think is it really utopian to think in 10 years you can have a situation where Israel is a pariah state? That's not, I know that's too long for the people of Gaza. I'm not saying all of this is too long. Too late now.
It is already too long.
Of course.
2 years of genocide and 77 years of occupation.
But I don't think Israel's going to get away with this. I do not believe... Look, there's two options, I'll be honest. I mean, there's a grim way made to end, but either this crime is accepted for what it is, one of the great crimes of our age, and action is taken in terms of those who facilitated it, and Israel, the Israeli project of subjugating the Palestinian people comes to an end, or humanity is heading for violent barbarism and fascism, and we have, I'm afraid, far worse problems to come anyway. That's the issue. And I think, for me, that's why we have to fight for accountability, because if this is normalised and legitimised, we're done. It's not just the Palestinian people who are done. If you legitimise this level of genocidal depravity, then anything is possible. And I think we're already heading the rise of fascism everywhere. So I just think those are our two, we either end up with justice and accountability and liberation for the Palestinian people and accountability for every single person who facilitated this crime, or we're going to go down the drain as a species anyway, I'm afraid. So I think that's why it's not just about Palestine, this really is about the future of humanity. And I think the Palestinian people have suffered horror and crime beyond the imagination of the vast majority of us. I can't imagine. It's only a tiny fraction of what I can actually imagine. But actually, I think this could transform the West in so many ways, because it has shocked people beyond words. And I think this will, unless we head for fascist barbarism, it could actually end in a new world. And that's what we've got to fight for.
Owen, let's end with that. Thank you very, very much for
coming
today. Thank you. Cheers.